All right, hi. Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Chris Monsieur. I'm a faculty member in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and together with Dr. Wong, we co-organized this seminar this quarter. We're very pleased today to have one of our own graduates presenting today. Michael Williams graduated with a master's degree in Civil and Environmental Engineering not that long ago, and now he's at Alta Planning, and he's going to talk to us today about advisory bike lanes in North America. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Dr. Monsieur. Thank you, everybody. My name is Michael Williams, as Dr. Monsieur said. Thank you for spending your time here, and I just want to say I'm honored to be back on this side of the mic here. I was there where you are more than a few times. I spent probably 5 to 7 years watching these seminars before coming back to PSU to get my degree. So I'm hoping Miguel doesn't have any criticism for my presentation after I'm done here. So let's get started. My name, Michael Williams, as we've already established. I've had, this is my third career, I guess you'd say. I started out bachelor's in computer science, master's in electrical engineering, did some R&D in biomedical engineering, was involved in the first development of the first implantable defibrillator, got some patents out of that work, moved to the hinterlands of Northern California, became a general contractor really by accident, spent about 15 years doing that, bridges, roads, schools, things of that nature. And while I was busy being a general contractor, I became also a volunteer activist and a self-educated active transportation engineer. And at some point, I think my activism and active transportation engineering started taking over my real work, and some friends held an intervention for me and said, Michael, you got to get some help. So I packed up my bags, came to Portland State, and got my degree in civil engineering, and now work as an engineer planner at Alta Planning and Design. Specific focus, interests, road diets, advisory bike lanes, and roundabouts. So this presentation, you're going to be hearing about a new bicycle and pedestrian facility being seen here in North America for the first time. Let's start talking about our roads. The U.S. has almost 3 million miles of paved roads. A lot of these roads are considered too narrow or too low a priority funding-wise to have bicycle or pedestrian facilities added. And these narrow roads can be threatening or downright dangerous to cyclists and pedestrians alike. But we have a way forward on these roads, and that way is based on human nature. Humans, turns out, like to stay within the lines. They color within the lines, they walk within the lines, and they drive within the lines. And designs that don't recognize this facet of human nature cause problems, as you see here with this young woman trying to share the lane with a car. But this new facility type, advisory bike lanes, uses that compulsion to create a safer roadway environment. So what does it look like? Let me use my pointer. What you have in this roadway, this advisory bike lane configuration, is a center travel lane that supports two-way vehicular travel. And then on either side of that center travel lane, you have bike lanes that are reserved for one-way travel. This new roadway configuration is suitable for low speeds, low to moderate speeds, low to moderate volumes. How does it work? Well, looking at the top slide, when a motorist is in the advisory bike lane on their own, they stay in that center travel lane, leaving the two bike lanes for people to enjoy and ride their bike as those people are there. When a driver encounters an oncoming vehicle, They merge into the bike lanes after yielding to the people already there in order to pass the oncoming traffic. Now, some people have an issue with this, surprisingly. Fiery destruction will reign until we're brought back to our senses and put the cars in their own lanes where they belong. But no, that's not true. We have examples, we have design guidance, we have history of successful use of this type of road already. In fact, on my way to work this morning, I had an example of this. Southwest Corbett, for the people not familiar with Portland, Southwest Corbett is my commute route, and I'm riding down Southwest Corbett, narrow residential road, and somebody's doing some remodeling along the way there. And they've got a pallet of siding in the parking lane, and cars parked frequently on the other side. I'm riding behind a car. Another car comes along. He slows and pulls over, lets that car pass, and we enter back into the main lane, just as this type of roadway operates. So, design guidance. Design guidance for this type of road has been around for at least 100 years, maybe longer. Right-hand side of the slide is a page from a 1930s highway capacity textbook that talks about one-lane roads, when you choose to make them two-lane roads, what kind of capacities you need to look at, etc. Slide on the left is a more recent design guidance document from the Federal Highway Administration for low-volume local roads, which also discusses using one lane for two-way traffic. Americans drive like this every day, just like I encountered this morning. Picture narrow residential roads clogged with on-street parking. Roads narrowly plowed after a snowstorm. Tight parking lots. One-lane roads, one-lane bridges. All of these circumstances require drivers to negotiate at slow speeds for an opportunity to pass oncoming traffic. And we have history of use. This picture is from the Netherlands, but in Europe we have thousands of kilometers of these facilities, of this roadway type. Not a whole lot of them have a lot of horse use, but they're all over the Netherlands. They are placed on roads with speed limits 20 to 35 miles an hour and volumes ranging up to 4,000 to 5,000 average daily trips or traffic, ADT. And I have, despite all this, some people still have issues with this roadway type. So what I'm going to do is play a video, and you're going to see an American advisory bike lane in action.
They're on streets too narrow to handle driving lanes, parking, and ordinary bike lanes. So what makes them so different? Check out the lines. Advisory bike lanes have dashed lines next to traffic. That means cars can move into the bike lanes, and they'll do just that when there's not enough room to get past oncoming cars. Of course, drivers need to watch for bikes before moving into the advisory bike lane and give them the right-of-way. Keeping an eye out for two-wheeled traffic.
Okay. So that was a video from the city of Minneapolis, an excerpt of a video from the city of Minneapolis, where they explain their various bicycle facility types. Sure. Dr. Monsieur. On that facility there, I think that was East 14th Street, and we will get the answer to that question in a slide not too far from now. All right, so we have some rationale for this type of roadway. We have some examples. We have some information around this, but what does the design guidance says? As engineers, we want official design guidance. Well, the FHWA has published the only design guidance of its kind on advisory bike lanes just recently, end of 2016. Alta wrote this in conjunction with the Federal Highway Administration. The feds call it an advisory shoulder. Everybody else calls them advisory bike lanes, but you may hear one or the other called. And what does this guidance say? Let's take a quick look. Within that document, we have speed and volume limits that are shown. We've got the preferred area below in the solid green, up to 25 miles an hour speed limit, 3,000 ADT. The less than preferred, or potential as they call it, up to 6,000 ADT and up to 35 miles an hour. In August of this year, a survey that I co-authored at Alta was released, and it reviewed all of the existing advisory bike lane installations in the U.S. and North America. And for the rest of the presentation, I'll be drawing from this and some of my personal work to tell you about some of the lessons learned. I've got some case studies for you and some summary data. We're going to dig into the engineering wonkiness first a little bit. In looking at these advisory bike lanes, we got a number of pieces of information for the installations. One was, what kind of traffic volume does the street support that this ABL is on? Here you've got a graph of 11 sites. There were 12 that we surveyed, but one was removed shortly after its installation. That's a whole nother presentation's worth of material there. You've got an average daily traffic on the y-axis. And you see most of the ABLs are well below 2,000, 2,500 ADT. There are two standouts there at the right-hand side, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Burlington, Vermont. We'll look at both of those as case studies a little further on in the presentation. The Burlington, Vermont one is very seasonal. This is the maximum ADT that road sees. But for most of the year, it gets much lower ADT. The Minneapolis, Minnesota ABL does, it's very urban, and it does a lot of traffic every day, weekdays. That's probably the most urban, most highly trafficked ABL in North America. And that's an interesting one on its own. How long are these advisory bike lane installations? Well, they're all under a half mile, and most are under a quarter mile. And this is a result of their use by many agencies as short connectors within existing networks. They're not really being used yet as facilities on their own, but really to make some of those connections that are hard to make, or where you have roadways that are unable to support standard bike lanes because of their width. Center lane width of ABLs. This is a hot topic of mine. Center lane widths are very subtle, and it's interesting to look at them and how they influence the operation of this roadway type. If you've got a narrow center lane width, 10 feet, 11 feet, 12 feet, it's very clear to a driver on that road that they will not be able to pass an oncoming vehicle without merging into the bike lanes. If your center lane is wide enough to where it's easy to pass oncoming traffic without merging into the bike lanes, well, you're essentially back to the configuration of a standard road with bike lanes. And no problem there either. You stay in the center lane, you pass your oncoming vehicle. In between those two, in between the narrow and the wide version, you have what I call the ambiguous zone. And what happens there, what can happen there, is if a driver encounters an oncoming vehicle and there's somebody in the bike lane, they're not sure if they can make that pass without using that bike lane territory or not. And whether that oncoming vehicle is going to stay way to the right or not, you don't know. So that ambiguous zone can lead you into poor passing decisions. And hopefully not often, but there may be injuries or collisions. So center lane width is very important. That's, again, a whole other topic we can go into, but I digress. But you see from this graph here, 10 to 20 feet, we've got a big outlier there at Sandpoint, Idaho, 22 feet wide. You go like this, yes, I see people doing that. I did that as well. They felt that because of the size of their pickups in Sandpoint, Idaho, that their travel lane should be 13, 14 feet wide. So to them, dropping down to 22 feet for a center lane width made sense. Total width of ABLs. And what I did here is I created a graph that on the vertical axis, you've got total width of the roadway, which is the width of your center lane, plus the width of both bike lanes. You've got an interesting outlier here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where their bike lanes are 2 3/4 feet wide. So they really were working to get that thing to fit. But that's quite an outlier. But what you get from this slide is the fact that ABLs hit this sweet spot of about 20 to 30 feet in width. If you're much smaller than 20 feet, you start getting into a situation where the markings may be so unfamiliar or so non-intuitive that the drivers may not know what's going on, at least American drivers, American or Canadian drivers. And if you get more than 30 feet, well, then you're back up to a standard street where you can get 2 travel lanes of 10 feet, 2 bike lanes of 5 feet wide, 30 feet, and your need for an ABL starts dropping. A couple more pieces of data. Number one, what kind of pavement markings do you use in the bike lane? Well, most installations use the standard bike lane markings. And this is, again, kind of a subtle, wonky thing. Bike lane markings mark a bike lane, which are supposed to be for the fairly exclusive use of bicycles. Not so with an advisory bike lane. 2 of the installations use shared lane markings, which, if you think about it, might be more appropriate for an advisory bike lane configuration. If you start reading the MUTCD, some issues even come with shared lane markings. 2 of the installations use no markings whatsoever. Posted speed limit, despite American guidance allowing up to 35 miles an hour. Only 4 had 30-mile-an-hour limits. 7 had 25-mile-an-hour limits. Oddly enough, 2 of the 30-mile-an-hour limit facilities were the narrowest ones, the ones in Cambridge that I mentioned where there were 2 3/4 foot wide bike lanes. That's a 30-mile-an-hour posted speed limit on that road. Now we're going to look at some case studies. Bloomington, Indiana, big college town. Again, here's a situation where they had an existing network. They had a student neighborhood, pictured here, on the other side of a highway, an interstate, from the university, Indiana University. And formerly, the students had to go some circuitous route to get to the university. Well, they built either an overpass or an underpass, I don't remember which, and they needed to not only connect the network on the other side of the highway to that bridge, but also capture the people in this neighborhood. So they came in, they had a route, they had a street that led right to the facility. They weren't able to widen that street. The thing I love most about this case study is they waited till the students had left for the summer, came in, put in the advisory bike lane, didn't tell a soul, and then when the students came back, they watched and waited to see what would happen. They got very little reaction, they said. They got no negative reaction, and almost nobody said anything. Some of the cyclists, if I remember correctly, some of the cyclist groups said good job, and that was about it. But this is unusual. Don't take that as a prediction of what can happen. Second case study, Burlington, Vermont. If you look at at the end of this road here is a popular park and a regional trail that runs along their lake. What this street looked like before they put in the advisory bike lane, it had on-street parking on both sides. And if you notice off to the right-hand side of the slide, you see a big tank there. There's an oil distributorship there. So they've got big trucks going up and down this street full of oil or gas, can't remember which. But they also had a lot of popular events at the park, a lot of people accessing the trail. So they had heavy seasonal traffic. What they ended up doing is taking all the on-street parking off that street, moved it into the park at the end of the street there, and put in advisory bike lanes. But what they did is that there's a subtle distinction here that's easy to not do correctly. They came from a viewpoint of designing it like a regular road. They said, we've got big trucks. We need room for those big trucks in this center lane. Well, that's not what you do. But it's an easy, subtle mistake to make. Many people are making it. And so what happens is they've got a center lane that's in this ambiguous zone. And they've already gotten complaints from cyclists about, hey, we're having issues with cars attempting to pass while we're in the bike lane, and things are getting uncomfortable, getting close, feels like dangerous conditions. So this is a good example of the ambiguous zone. And kudos to Burlington for removing on-street parking and making that possible. Third case study, Hanover, New Hampshire. Small town, 11,000. They've got a big medical center there, big university, so despite the size of their town, they do have quite a few people around there. This is a single-family residential neighborhood. Looks very rural, acts very rural. They originally had a street that had no markings at all. They were having problems with speeding, as one might guess. And they had a lot of people jogging and coming through there on their bikes, so they wanted to address that. They also were interested in trying out advisory bike lanes on a calmer street before trying it on a busier street. So they tried it on Valley Road here. Total success. Speeding issues went down. Traffic volumes went down. Ped and bicycle volumes went up. And one of the things I really like about this example is that when the residents were asked about their road, they said, we don't want sidewalks. We like the rural feel of our neighborhood, and we think sidewalks will make it less so. So in this case, the advisory bike lanes create a nice sidewalk facility as well. Next case study is the one I mentioned earlier, Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is the one that sees almost 5,000 ADT. Very urban, highly trafficked. And again, they needed a short connector to connect two facilities within their network. And what they did was an all-out public engagement blitz. Along this road, you've got a private college, I believe, one or two churches, medical clinic at the far end of this road, and then lots of businesses alongside. So they went and talked to everybody, a lot of education about how this thing works, what they're going to do. And it works great. I mean, 5,000 ADT, some people might feel uncomfortable with that, but it's working for them. Ottawa, Ontario. This is our only case study and the only full advisory bike lane in Canada currently. Somerset Street East carries twice as many bicycles as cars. They're going to rebuild it at some point to turn into a much more bike-friendly street. But until they do that, they wanted something to help support the bike traffic there. The two things I like about this facility are that you have the hatched areas showing the door zone, which this is the only advisory bicycle lane using that feature. It's been used on bike lanes before, but this is the only ABL I'm aware of that uses it. And this large format sign that they used shortly after installation to help unfamiliar users of the road know how to use it. It's difficult. Some communities have attempted to create signs like this, but it's questionable in my mind whether, as you're driving along, you can take in a sign like this and really get meaningful information out of it. But the advantage to this sign is that it's much larger, and it's very simple. It's the best of the signs I've seen, and I like the fact that it's temporary and you can take it down after a while. So then, let's see, what are we doing here? Oh, all right. So that's the end of my case study portion. Now we're going to take a look at the aggregate. What did we learn from all of these things together? So our first lesson is that a lot of these advisory bike lanes are urban. A lot of people have pitched advisory bike lanes as a solution to this enormous inventory of American rural roadways that will never get enough funding for bicycle and or pedestrian facilities to be added. There are a lot of rural roads out there. I think the split is 75-25, depending on how you define rural versus urban. 75% of our roads are rural. So that's a heck of a lot of roads. But as of now, most of those ABLs are found in urban environments. And you can theorize on why that is. I like to at times. Second lesson, education is important. The only ABL that was removed after installation was one for which there was not a lot of public outreach done ahead of time. And in talking to the agency that installed that one, they recognized that if they had done a better job conducting outreach, educating people to how you use these things, things might have gone differently. Conversely, some of the most successful ABLs were ones that made public outreach an important part of their campaign. ABLs are intuitive. Even on ABLs where no public or little public outreach was done, drivers are seen using this facility safely and correctly. Parking, on-street parking. If you're going to put an ABL on a street that has on-street parking, you need to make sure the parking is well used. There have been instances where unfamiliar drivers come upon an ABL with on-street parking on both sides. That parking is empty, and they're wondering what the heck's going on. There are lines everywhere, and it just looks very different from a normal roadway. And so some confusion could result. The other important piece of information that comes along with your well-used parking is it tells the driver that this road supports two-way travel. Some people get confused, oh, maybe this is a one-way street. But when you see parked cars going both ways, you know this is a two-way street. Narrow center lanes work and may be safer than wider center lanes. This is a pretty extreme example of a narrow center lane. This is over in the Netherlands. But of the advisory bike lanes we surveyed, 2 of them had 9-foot center lanes, 2 of them had 10-foot center lanes. Those work, and if you draw some or extrapolate some finding from the studies that talk about the effect on driver speed of narrow lanes, you can make a case that narrower center lanes are better than wider center lanes. Color. The Dutch color their advisory bike lanes to good effect. The FHWA has approved the use of color for standard bike lanes. I think it's still an interim approval. But their guidance for advisory bike lanes is to use color only in conflict areas. So we're going to have to see how this one plays out. I'd love to see the use of color on advisory bike lanes. I have some questions about how it'll work, but I think it would be a huge advantage. They're safe. 5 of the 11 ABLs we surveyed had professional engineering studies done. They looked at crash data for the years preceding, crash data for the years after. Some did videotaping of interactions. All of them pronounced them safe. And all of the agencies I spoke to said, hey, we'd put these in again on the right street. Research. We need more research on these things. This ambiguous zone idea I talk about, what's its effect? What is the width of that ambiguous zone? I think Dutch guidance currently says not to use center lane widths of between 12 and 16 feet. Is that applicable to the North American context? Does it need to be adjusted for our larger cars? I don't know. But there are some significant questions that don't really have answers yet that we need to be looking at. Challenges. This is my short list. Challenges, human nature. As I've said before, some people just flat out say no. You're not putting on my street this game of chicken you're coming up with. They don't like the idea, they never will. Awareness. There are a lot of people that aren't aware of this facility type. I was just at the California Bike Summit a couple of weeks ago, summit full of cycling activists, and there were a number of people there that had never heard of advisory bike lanes. So if your dyed-in-the-wool activists are unaware of this facility type, there are probably a lot of engineers, a lot of lay people that have not heard of it either. Excuse me. Site distance criterion. The Crow manual, the Dutch guidance on this facility type, doesn't mention a site distance criterion for this, for ABLs. We have a site distance criterion in the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks guide that I showed you earlier, but they recommend the use of passing site distance. And that presents issues because the model that the passing site distance numbers are based on makes some assumptions about vehicle length, speed differential, and operation of the road. Primarily, they assume that you've got cars in separate lanes, and there's a set of steps you go through to pass, which is, well, you're familiar with passing, you know what happens. But the point is, those activities aren't the way advisory bike lanes work. You're already out in the center lane. So, fortunately, passing site distance provides a conservative value for site distance. Legislative uncertainty. The 2 states I'm most familiar with, California and Oregon, have state laws that make the status of advisory bike lanes either somewhat uncertain or in some people's minds just flat out illegal. I know Portland was wanting to install advisory bike lanes on a couple of streets, but it was the legal issues that prevented it. Lane widths and ambiguous zone. The thing that surprises me, one of the things that surprises me about advisory bike lanes is, boy, here you've got a chance to make a big, fat, wide bike lane, right? But what do people do? 5 feet, 5 feet. You really need to just push that thing out 6, 7, 8 feet, make a nice wide bike lane. It doesn't matter that the center lane is narrower. Make a nice wide bike lane, support side-by-side riding, easy bicycle passing. If you've got on-street parking, you're giving them more than enough room to get out of that door zone. Go ahead, hatch the door zone. So that's something that needs to change, in my opinion. And the ambiguous zone, which I talked about already, not having the center lane be in that middle odd zone. Facility selection criteria. So now we have, for our low-speed, low-volume roads, you've got a fully shared roadway. which is just no markings, let people manage themselves. You've got the bike boulevard designation, and you've got advisory bike lanes, at least those three. How do you choose between those three? I have my ideas, but there has yet to be a real discussion about what factors people should look at when choosing between them. ADA issues as a sidewalk. If an agency wants to put in advisory bike lanes and their stated intention is to use them as sidewalks as well, you have to meet ADA and ProWag requirements. And if you're familiar with those at all, you know that those yellow tactile strips that you have at the bottom of sidewalk curb ramps, those always go between the pedestrian facility and the motor vehicle facility. Well, on an ABL, what does that mean? Does that mean you have to line the entire bike lane portion with the yellow tactile strips? I don't know. My feeling is that most agencies are just going to avoid this issue altogether, not state their intention to provide pedestrian facilities with advisory bike lanes. They'll just call it a bike lane and they're off to the races. So, advisory bike lanes provide bicycle facilities on narrow roads, sweet spot 20 to 30 feet wide, successful so far up to 5,000 ADT. They can provide sidewalks and traffic calming benefits. They're inexpensive, cheap, cheap, cheap. If you're chip sealing or sealing a road, it's free. And they reduce maintenance. I didn't really talk about this very much in my presentation, but two mechanisms for degradation and failure of asphalt roads are vehicle loads on the edge of the roadway, which cause the cracking and the failure of the edge. And on narrow roads, you get, on roads with center lines, your cars are conscribed to a very narrow lane of travel, and you get ruts where the tires go. And that's a very common maintenance job or construction job to have, is to cut out those ruts and repave those ruts to restore the road. What advisory bike lanes do for you is they get the cars, number one, away from the edge, and number two, they're not always in the exact same channel. They move around a bit. So it should reduce maintenance. How much it does, I don't know. So that concludes my summary. Thank you, everybody, for spending your time with me, and I'm guessing there may be some questions. Do we need to give him a microphone? Or? No. All right.
Are there any examples of advisory bike lanes interacting with something like a roundabout, or where you have like a complex of?
Very good question. After we published the white paper, of course, everybody raised their hand and said, "Hey, wait a minute, you didn't talk about us." And there is an advisory bike lane in Maine. It's either Yarmouth or Scarborough, I believe. It's on a rural road, very rural road, and it's quite a long one, and it goes through a roundabout. And what they did is they continued the broken lines through the roundabout. So now, if you know the MUTCD at all, one of the strict rules is you don't put bike lanes in a roundabout. So is that a bike lane? I don't know. So, I mean, it's a very, very low volume situation, so it probably works fine the way it is. But it's a situation that shows that the regulatory and legislative landscape hasn't yet caught up to this kind of facility. Somebody else? Trevor?
The gray area of middle lane width where people are questioning, can I or can I not get by this other vehicle? Are there any additional markings that are ever put in to at least say this is as far over as you need to get? I mean, the center line would mildly defeat the purpose, but would prevent some of those issues.
You're not the first person to ask that question, and I don't have any good ideas on how to do that without disrupting the whole operation of the advisory bike lane roadway. I mean, the idea is that the entire roadway is available for use by the car. If you try to put in a line to say you can't go much further than this, then you're essentially just creating a standard road with a much narrower bike lane than you would normally have. So I don't know if that's doable. Anybody else? Yeah.
Christine, I was just curious about the difference in cultures between the Netherlands and the United States, because as you said, we have bigger cars here, and I think that I'm just curious about the attitude of driving here compared to in the Netherlands. And I noticed the pictures you showed of the Netherlands were, as you said, slower traffic roads. So where there's a horse and a bike and a truck, and here I think we have different roads, fewer horses. So what have you noticed about that?
Well, it's interesting because the Dutch design guidance for advisory bike lanes allows them on roads up to 35 miles an hour. When they allow them on roads that fast, their volumes are much lower than our guidance gives. I think 3,000 ADT is probably if I remember correctly, that's the highest they'll allow for 35 mile an hour roads. So the number of interactions between bicycles and cars is quite a bit lower. You're right. There is a cultural difference. But again, look at Portland. Look at any other city that has a fair number of cyclists on its roads. The whole safety numbers effect. Once you get some cyclists out there and drivers know that they're expected to see them, I think you get that culture. Now, you can't see this on video, but she's making a disbelieving face, which I can understand. But despite the good point you're making, the question is, would you rather have an advisory bike lane, or would you rather have a standard two-lane road with no bicycle facilities?
That's my only choice, then I'd go.
So I try to come back to, that's really the question. If we had enough money to, I don't know, re-educate people or add facilities everywhere we wanted one, that'd be a different story. But we don't.
You had said that in Portland they had considered this sort of thing and they ran into legal issues. What were those issues?
They wanted to put one on Southwest Carruthers, I believe. And I haven't looked at this, so I'm not going to don't quote me on any of this, despite the fact I'm being recorded. I guess that doesn't help me. I believe the issue is that, I can't remember now, to be honest. But it was, Roger Geller talked about this. The issue is that the bike lane has to be for exclusive use of bicycles. I'm not sure. I don't know. It should be my short answer.
Because it's so fuzzy.
It's not fuzzy. The current law is set up for normal bike lanes. And this new way of having a road operate just isn't supported by the current law. So, sure.
I don't know if you mentioned this before, but were there trends in the types of incidences when you had lanes, the center lanes that were in the ambiguous zone? Like, were there more vehicle-on-vehicle incidents or vehicle-bicycle incidents?
We don't have that data. I don't have that data. I have copies of some of the engineering studies they performed, and all of them, it looks good. I don't have, let me think about this. I don't believe I have engineering studies for the ambiguous zone, center lanes. That would be an interesting thing to look at. My guess is that the facility type is so unusual and so new to most people that that's going to slow them down. But who knows? I don't know. That's another area of research that I'd love to be involved in. That's actually something I should mention that I didn't mention is we're starting to look at some research opportunities. If people out there that are watching this webinar have a road that they think might be applicable for putting an ABL in, please let me know. I'd love to have an opportunity to take a look at it. I'm submitting a proposal with Dr. Catherine Hunter-Jaworski to ODOT to look at advisory bike lanes, and we're talking to other folks as well as a possibility. But it's questions like that, center lane width, a whole bunch of issues that we'd love to look at in more depth. Yep.
So you have been like comparing a lot of cities. Do you think that like less places like the Netherlands people bike more than like hilly areas?
I didn't hear your whole question. Max is going by.
Because like besides comparing the bike lanes, you also compare like different cities. So do you think that in places that like geography is like flatter, like flat, like in the Netherlands, do you think people bike more because of that? Because sometimes if you don't have like a physical preparation, you feel, oh, I don't want to like bike up a hill, or I just want to bike. But if it's flat, maybe it's easy for you to go.
So the question is, do people bike more where it's flat? In general, I would think flat is better, and that might be good. But if you've been to the Netherlands and you've experienced the wind there, it's 6 one, half dozen the other. You get some, in fact, it wasn't too many months ago where I saw a video, and it was this plaza in some town in the Netherlands, and everybody was off their bike, and they were being blown over. It was some sort of incredible windstorm they were having, and I just had to laugh because if you've been there and have ridden in the wind, you know that flat doesn't mean squat when you're trying to go against a 30, 40 mile an hour wind. So yes, in general, but I also know a lot of places where wind and hills, they have plenty of cyclists. Any more questions?
I understand that besides, of course, you already touched on the challenge of using advisory bike lane as the potential for pedestrians or sidewalk. Places where there is no sidewalk, of course, the ADA compliance is an issue or challenge there. You already touched on. But besides that, what do you think the overall potential, of course, probably not the official sidewalk, but what other pros and cons besides the ADA?
Pros and cons besides ADA compliance. The big pro I see, and I come from a rural environment, and really that's where my passion lies, is in the rural setting. There are so many roads in the rural setting, millions of miles of road in the rural setting, where there are no sidewalks. You've got a roadway and then drainage swales on either side. And what happens is people either don't walk or they end up walking in the road. And I love the fact that this type of roadway facility would support walking in the road in a much safer way than exists now. So that's the biggest pro I see of it as it applies to pedestrian facilities, and the fact that it's free. You know, you get a sidewalk, you chip seal the road, or you seal the road, you got to restripe it afterwards anyway. You restripe it this way, and it's essentially free, and you get sidewalks. So that's the biggest pro in my mind, by far. Cons, I can't think of any right now. Maybe you get people thinking they could walk there like a kid that shouldn't be out there. Or, I don't know. You can make stuff up, but without more examples, it's hard to say what the pros and cons are. Yeah.
Do you Is in the Netherlands, are they having as much a problem about distracted drivers as we are? Because do they have people driving with the cell phone as much as we do? Because I would think that might be a concern with.
Yeah, right. I don't know about that. I'm not a Netherlands expert at all. I've only been there once, twice. So I don't know.
Is that a concern for what this study, about this study? Because I agree with you. It's a great idea since it's free, but right now we're in a culture of a lot of distracted drivers.
Well, one of the things, I have another presentation which talks about design do's and don'ts and talks about the issues there. And one of the things that we prefer not to do in the North American context, that the Dutch don't have any problems doing, is putting in vertical elements to either persuade drivers to come back into the center lane or to reduce speeds. That could be a possible solution to help people pay more attention. But again, that would be a question you'd have to do a lot of study to actually be able to answer. Saw a question back here.
I have just a question. Do you know what the status of color is with FHWA currently? Is there a movement to put color on these advisory bike lanes?
Yes. So currently the FHWA approves the use of color in standard bike lanes wherever you want to do it. Or it's interim approval. The guidance that, and one thing I didn't talk about was that currently the advisory bike lanes are seen as an experimental facility. And in order to install one, you should go through what's called the request to experiment process with the FHWA. The FHWA has suggestions for what they would like to see you do for your advisory bike lanes. One of the suggestions is that color be limited to areas of conflict where cars are crossing the advisory bike lane. That appears to recommend the use of color maybe in intersections within the bike lane or some other place where cars are maneuvering across the bike lane. But the cars use these bike lanes, right? In any situation, any place along the roadway. So you could make an argument that is approval for use of color in the bike lane portion of the road. It's not clear to me what they intended with that, but I'd love to see color used on these things. It works great in the Netherlands. I think it would be of use here as well.
Have some of these cities tried to use color, or are they?
There's only one ABL that uses color. It's in Minneapolis, and they use it in an intersection just to highlight the conflict zone there. Only one. Yes?
So I think the ABL works pretty well with another new thing, the shared space, especially for busy street. You have some case study looking at some of the pretty busy commercial street. Do you see any cases that people combine those two?
Shared space with advisory bike lanes? I'm not completely sure how to differentiate those. ABLs are truly shared spaces. They're just showing a preference, right? We'd really like it if your cars would stay over here and then your bikes would stay here. And in the American context, there's no legislation yet that says bikes have to stay in the bike lanes. Maybe they're allowed in the center travel lane as well. Or are there instances where cars aren't allowed to go in the bike lane? There's no legislative support, there's no regulatory support talking about the operation of advisory bike lanes yet. And so right now, to me, it's kind of open season. It's a shared space, and people can kind of wander around as they like. Again, we're drawing on that human compulsion to stay between the lines, right? Cars are going to tend to stay in the middle. Bikes are going to want to stay on the side, and that's what makes it work. So I don't know if that's an answer specifically, but no, I'm not aware of the conjunction of those two. As I've said, all the ones I've seen are normally short connectors, and they're connecting other bike facilities on standard streets, but no shared space elements. Trevor?
You had one image of the very narrow center lane. It almost looked too narrow to have two cars pass.
It was too narrow for one car. It was narrower than the width of a normal car.
Mind blown, right?
Why, is it a lane? That doesn't make sense. If you can't fit a car in it, how is it a lane?
Any requirement that if you do something and mark it, even narrower than a lane, that two cars need to be at least able to pass?
Well, the road width has to be able to support two cars passing. The pavement area available to drivers has to support that. But going back to the narrow center lane, current FHWA suggestion on their request to experiment process lists 10 feet as kind of the minimum width. And that's fine. That's starting to get down there. But I don't think, if you wanted to create an ABL in the North American context where the center lane was narrower than one car, I'm not sure. There might be some confusion out there. People might just not know what the heck's going on. The Netherlands can do it because they're familiar with advisory bike lanes. They have some expectation, they have some education, history, so they can figure out what's going on. Could we here without that exposure? I don't know. All right. I think if nobody has any more questions, I think we're out of time. Thank you. This is where everybody claps. Thank you for coming.